So the background imagery on this slide is from Buckminster Fuller's 1951 patent filing for geodesic dome. And I put this up to remind us that the linkages between immersive design and social change are deeply historical. I think, for example, of Fuller's design for the US Pavilion at the 1967 Montreal Expo, a geodesic dome echo of the Paris Fair from the 1939 New York World's Fair, both housing utopianist views of imagined future, better societies. And there are many, many examples of these throughout history. Examples of immersive storytelling spaces, technologies and techniques that predate the digital. And in many cases, these immersive storytelling technologies were used to tell stories about how things used to be, providing particular perspectives on the past, or particular immersive telling of history, such as in the panorama there from Robert Barker. But they were also often used to provide an immersive imagining of futures yet to come. But today we seem to be in a new iteration of this trajectory with the explicit idea of the empathy machine, which, while it shares some things with this long legacy, it's also distinct. So immersive filmmaker Chris Milk famously described VR as an empathy machine in his 2015 TED Talk, stating that by using VR, quote, we become more compassionate, we become more empathetic, and we become more connected, and ultimately we become more human. Milk's claim, which may seem glib at first, has been astutely critiqued by many scholars, but it's worth examining further still because it's emblematic of a pervasive perspective on technology today that's often encountered in the technology industry, in STEM disciplines, and even in popular culture at large. The seeming simplicity of this perspective belies the many layers of assumption underneath, many of which I believe actually hamper designers in achieving meaningful impact with their works. So to get at some of these assumptions, I'll be investigating the following questions in this talk. What is empathy? How does social change actually work? And what does all of this mean for design with immersive technology? So let's take a look at the tacit assumptions that underlie statements about VR as an empathy machine. There are two main parts to this larger claim. So one part is a claim about what empathy is and how it can influence people in society. And a second claim centers on the nature of interactive immersive media as somehow particularly conducive to fostering this specific type of empathy in viewers. Now, what is meant by empathy in the usage from Milk and other journalists and immersive documentary makers working with immersive tech today should be made explicit. Empathy in these cases is used to denote a positive outcome in the viewers due to a change in attitude or belief, with a likelihood that this change may result in pro-social behavior and even actions advancing justice. And it's worth examining how this kind of colloquial understanding of empathy holds up against scholarship on the topic, which I will discuss in a bit. But I want to point out a couple more layers of assumption here in this concept of the empathy machine first. So more deeply embedded in this definition is actually an implied mental model of how social change works. And so the question also arises as to whether or not this empathy-based model of social change is accurate. Is it based in reality? And then at the foundation of all of these assumptions, there's an idea about the ontology of technology itself as a labor-saving device that is capable of simplifying complexity. So this is my dissection of the empathy machine here. And so viewed from this perspective, it becomes easy to see why this idea of the empathy machine could be so attractive to many across technology industries, STEM disciplines, and popular culture. The reasoning might go something like this. If only we can use immersive tech to unlearn prejudice and inspire action, then the hard, painful work of the emotional and intellectual labor of coming to terms with prejudicial beliefs and attitudes could be made easier. I think that's part of the hope that's wrapped up in that idea of the empathy machine. But there's a connection to be made here with Robin DiAngelo's concept of white fragility as discussed in her original 2011 paper. DiAngelo developed the concept of white fragility to understand and name the defensiveness, fear, misdirected anger, and inaction often displayed by white people when confronted with participation and complicity in perpetuating oppressive racist systems. The idea of using an immersive entertainment technology, such as our virtual reality, changes the involuntary emotional response, plays into a fantasy that neatly aligns with a privileged positionality, seeking quick, easy, relatively painless methods of mitigation that ultimately fall far short of actual change. This perspective on technology as a labor-saving device fits well with some dominant so-called common sense, but wrong-headed ideas about technologies as neutral tools that can take the burden of labor from humans and kind of seamlessly increase efficiency. That concept has been notably critiqued by Langdon Winter and Susan Lee Starr and many other scholars in science and technology studies, and famously lampooned by satirist Rube Goldberg, as you see here. So this supposed ease of immersive tech for social change, it can be very compelling. I think it's a very seductive idea, actually, particularly compared with other methods for prejudice reduction, such as in-person intergroup dialogue training, which require many resources, mostly trained practitioners and teachers, people who have to be paid, and can take a lot of time, even years. The technological fantasy of the immersive media empathy machine imagines a mass medium that can seamlessly reach scores of individuals, necessitate no actual interpersonal contact with the others these individuals may seek to empathize with, and smoothly and easily change minds in minutes. Unfortunately, the foundational ontologies, both of technology and of social change that are embedded within the empathy machine idea, are at odds with key concepts in scholarly research on social change. So it turns out the media artifacts produced within this imaginary are often more likely to serve to assuage the privileged person's guilt and enrich the artifact's creators through money or social capital or both, rather than affect true social transformation. So next, let's look at what exactly is empathy. Is it an emotion, a media-induced response, a personality-based positioning, or something else? There's a wealth of scholarship on empathy and related phenomena such as compassion, identification, and transference. Steve LaRocco's research can provide us an important perspective on the ethical complexity of empathy, which is relative to our discussion given a focus on social change. So LaRocco understands empathy as a type of positioning of the self towards the other, as opposed to an emotion or a feeling. So LaRocco says empathy is an orientation to the other, one that attunes to some aspect of the other's feelings or emotions or thoughts, yet which may not engage the other's otherness at all. To put the point succinctly, feeling with is not the same as feeling for. Empathy for ethical behavior is a crucial interceptive vocalizer, but by itself is an orientation that may not direct the better angels of our nature to direct action. So LaRocco's research is underscoring the uncertainty around the potential of empathic positioning. And he points out there are many possibilities along a spectrum, all the way from authentic identification with another to a more selective empathy that seeks to misconstrue the other, perhaps, as similar to the self, or identifies only with aspects of the other perceived as similar to the self. LaRocco points out that due to this wide range of empathic responses, it's a mistake to draw a causal relationship between empathy and compassion. So while empathy is commonly thought of as a positive, warm, emotional response, it can be directed and instrumentalized or used as a tool in a predatory manner. And this fictional example really nicely illustrates the usage of empathy in this interrogation scene from Star Wars, in which the villainous Kylo Ren is seeking to understand resistance fighter Rey in order to probe for weaknesses in her psyche so he can more easily defeat her.
You know I can take whatever I want. I'm so lonely. So afraid to leave. At night, desperate to sleep. You imagine an ocean. I see it. I see the island. And Han Solo. You feel like he's the father you never had. he would have disappointed you.
So why is she so upset? She's being empathized with. Because here we see the capacity to weaponize empathy, right? And it's actually that capacity to empathize, to weaponize empathy has actually been important in the development of early VR systems, many of which were first designed to facilitate military training and simulation. In these systems, such as Flat World, America's Army, Living Worlds, and others, soldiers are trained to empathize with an other, characterized as an enemy in this case, in order to anticipate their actions, so they may be more efficiently killed. And indeed, one of the earliest interactive immersive systems was Frank Waller's gunnery trainer, designed for the US Army during the Second World War. That was later declassified after the war and commercialized as Cinerama, an early immersive cinema format that presaged IMAX and then later VR technologies. So VR and game technologies have a long history of entanglement in military simulation, which cannot be discounted when we're seeking to understand the embedded values designed into such systems, even as they get repurposed for entertainment today. Empathy's invasive potentials have also been noticed by several other theorists, important theorists, such as bell hooks and Lisa Nakamura, particularly as evident in technological systems that seek to provide the viewer or interactor with an empathic response experience. Hooke's discussion of supposedly empathy-inducing films draws out the absence of the actual other, who is represented, meaning the direct experience of empathy, which normally involves a process of consent and negotiation from all participants, cannot take place because the filmic other is absent. This total absence of the other persists in many immersive media works, neatly preserving the privileged interactor's safety and comfort over the consent and agency of the others represented. Why is the other's story more palatable as a mediation, as opposed to indirect human interaction? Hooks further unpacks this unilateral gaze at the representational other as colonizing and racist, as taking voice more than giving it, and at the core of cultural appropriation. There's a connection to be made here between the twin logics of the racist colonizing gaze that Hooks is writing about and Laura Mulvey's theorizing of the filmic male gaze. I mean, after all, white supremacy and misogyny are old bedfellows. Lisa Nakamura bridges this argument with a discussion of capitalism and delves into the dubious motivations of technology companies today who, in the face of their industry's morally bankrupt history of systems that instrumentalize empathy for exploitation and violence, now find it expedient to recast their systems as in service of the social good in opportunistic but ultimately empty gestures. And here's a quote from Bell Hooks in her discussion in Black Looks, Race and Representation, in which she describes the eating of the other being consumed through the so-called empathic gaze. Philosopher Paul Bloom's research provides another very interesting critique on empathy, looking at empathy as a dangerously ambiguous compass for moral decision-making. So Bloom points out that studies of empathy are based on individuals identifying with other individuals, but not situated within the large social context that surround us all and make actual social problems actually complex. Bloom discusses examples such as the funds directed toward the Make-A-Wish Foundation, which provides a wonderful personal experience to terminally ill children, versus funds directed to the Against Malaria Foundation, which supplies mosquito netting to children in need, saving many hundreds of children's lives. And Bloom points out that because Make-A-Wish so effectively leverages empathy in its solicitations, it's able to garner far more funding than the Malaria Foundation. So Bloom contends that empathically, donors feel connected to the promises and pathos of Make-A-Wish, but he's pointing out that morally and rationally, we must agree that saving many children's lives is a better goal than providing a single child with a wonderful experience, no matter how deserving the child or how emotionally fulfilling for the giver. Bloom's work also reminds us about the really uneven legacy of empathic artifacts in spurring social change that advances justice. He notes that while novels such as Dickens' Oliver Twist and Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin have been cited as helping to motivate social change, they also misfire badly in many ways, exploiting and appropriating those who they hope to support. And we also must remember there are counterpart works of social significance that have advanced causes furthering oppression and domination through empathy. such as Ian Rand's novels, or even Hitler's memoir, in which the reader is encouraged to empathize with these beleaguered protagonists who fend off others who are characterized as social spongers and degenerates to rise above victorious. Certainly, these empathic artifacts have also functioned as their creators intended, inspiring many to join oppressive and violent causes. So let's shift our focus away from history and back to immersive media today more specifically. And we can see that some of the problems found in the older media discussed are also persisting in many of the augmented and virtual reality experiences designed today for empathic response. Clouds over Sidra, for example, Chris Milk's 2015 VR documentary about the Syrian refugee crisis falls into this category. Milk promoted the VR experience as successful due to the medium's ability to fill the viewer's field of view, thus creating a virtual sense of presence for the viewer who feels as if they are co-located in a Syrian refugee camp with the film's protagonist. However, this conflation of simulated co-location with empathy and an outcome of social change has been very astutely critiqued by Clune and some others who've noted that while VR may virtually place the viewer in another space, the viewers still themselves with their own subjectivity and their own positionality. And Clune points out that other people's consciousnesses are not simply other spaces, and highlights that the as if of VR is just not at all the same thing of the lived reality of fleeing to a refugee camp. The VR viewer can simply remove the HMD when they tire of the experience. Leaving a refugee camp is a lot more complicated. So this myth that by merely entering an immersive simulation of another person's environment, you can understand their perspective. This is the, stand in another person's shoes argument, right? This has insidious effects, even for well-intentioned viewers. So in the case of white viewers seeking empathy with the perspectives of people of color, there's a long racist history of whites donning blackness that must be considered. Their ongoing legacies of minstrelsy and blackface persist, as does the equally misguided impulse toward what scholar Alicia Gaines describes as cross-racial identification, with seemingly well-intentioned white people seeking to become Black for a day to advance their own personal understanding of racism. And Gaines's book is excellent. I encourage you to take a look if you haven't come across it already. Gaines's research highlights that even when whites may approach such an ill-advised project with the aim of advancing social justice, this outcome has yet to materialize for these types of appropriative, invasive moves. And in the end, the people who benefit most were the white impersonators, both monetarily and in terms of social capital. So this type of instrumentalized empathy functions in the same manner as the colonialist rhetoric of extraction, allowing the white oppressor to mine a Black other for value, knowledge, and power. Okay, so given all this, how does social change happen? Next, we'll examine some scholarship on the nature of social change, its many actors and processes, and discuss what kind of role, if any, immersive media could play. So just as empathy is very complex, so too is social change. There are two major camps of thought about how social change happens, and they could be described as the prejudice reduction model and the collaborative social action model. So the scholarship on prejudice reduction dates from post-World War II, interestingly around the same time period we see the birth of VR, and centers on individuals in society who hold positions of power and prejudicial opinions about those who they oppress. And the focus in this scholarship is on reducing prejudice among these individual actors by providing corrective information that counters negative stereotypes. The aim there is to reduce conflict and mitigate harm. I've got a couple of examples from queer film here. So the prejudice reduction model, I like to think of as the flawless model. If you know this film, Philip Seymour Hoffman is a queer drag queen. Robert De Niro is a really grumpy homophobic guy. Robert De Niro has a stroke. Philip Seymour Hoffman's his neighbor. De Niro ends up having to get over some of those prejudices because he meets Hoffman, and he has a very, they both have transformative experiences through their long-term friendship. But really the idea here is grumpy and hateful people just need to come around. That's the prejudice reduction model of social change. There's a second camp of research on social change that focuses on coalition building and intergroup relations with the aim of facilitating collaborative social action. And the focus here is the disruption of existing systems and structures, which may indeed necessitate conflict and even in some cases, violence. Both of these models of social change are necessary, right? With a focus on individuals and the mitigation of harm at some times, and at other times focuses on coalition and the overhaul of systems. The question is, how to balance the two perspectives. And in terms of the collaborative social action model, another queer film example, we could call it the Stonewall Uprising model of social change, right? So for change to happen through this model, we need these surprising coalitions to come together. And it might get pretty rough and violent and take a long time to make progress. So even though both of these models of social change are valid and they're needed, I do want to point out there's a potentially dangerous alignment between the focus on individualism in the prejudice reduction model of social change and the emphasis on white individualism as discussed by D'Angelo. This emphasis on individualism can act to thwart meaningful change, actually, by providing absolution for members of oppressive groups, such as white people who may feel they've already done the work or they're woke enough. And because they aren't, individually racists, they don't need to work to actively dismantle the logics and structures of whiteness. So nevertheless, there's a place for individual focus and learning in terms of examining one's own biases and prejudices. Sociologist Bobby Harrow provides useful discussion and a graphic model of how these two perspectives on social change, prejudice reduction and collaborative social action, can operate in confluence. In Harrow's cycle of socialization, the process of socialization is described as systematic training in how to be each of our social identities throughout our lives. And this cycle represents how the socialization process happens, from what sources it comes, how it affects our lives, and how it perpetuates itself. And there's all of media in that cycle, okay? So in Harrow's model, we see that media participate as just one node among many, and they function in aggregate, not as individual media artifacts. This is because this research-based theory of social change includes no evidence for a single media artifact's impact. As Harrow's model depicts, media participate as just one mode among many others in the powerful forces of socialization at work to instruct us from the youngest age as to how we should behave to maintain the status quo in social structures of power. Now, Harrow also provides insight into how oppression may be disrupted through a second model, which she calls a cycle of liberation, opening up opportunities, but not guarantees, for shifts towards social justice. And she notes about this model, it's important to say that you can enter this cycle of liberation at any point through slow evolution or a critical incident, and will repeat or recycle many times in this process. There's no specific beginning or end point, just as one is never done working to end oppression. And she also points out that liberation is based in something far bigger than me as an individual, or us as a coalition, or our organization as a community, or any one nation, or any particular world. It's about the force that connects us all to one another as living beings. That force is defined very differently by every spiritual belief system, but which binds us by the vision there can be a better world and we can help to create it. These are conversations we may not be so used to having in a design lab, perhaps, or in the design classes we teach. But if social change, is the goal, if liberatory transformation and justice really is the goal, then these conversations become pretty crucial. Again, Harrow's models conceptualize media as just one node among many that work in collaboration and sometimes opposition to shift any one individual's attitudes, beliefs, and actions. There's no research showing it's possible to use a single technology, let alone a single media artifact, to circumvent the complex and arduous labor of the cycle of liberation. So how do media participate in these cycles of socialization and liberation described by Harrow? While a single media artifact functions as just one node among many, the role of media in aggregate is still significant. even media that are not explicitly designed to teach or persuade will carry some embedded values of the society they're created within, and therefore they do the important work of reinforcing dominant narratives. Now, dominant narratives aren't necessarily bad. For example, treat your neighbor as yourself could be considered a dominant narrative that encourages pro-social behavior or even kindness. But other dominant narratives, however, do include oppressive ideas that target marginalized groups such as women, trans and non-binary people, people of color, people with disabilities, people struggling in poverty, immigrants, and others. So these oppressive dominant narratives reinforce negative stereotyping about these groups and function to maintain or even worsen these groups' marginalized status and hamper access to power. But within media at large, there are also examples explicitly designed to teach, persuade, or even coerce. And we might discuss this subset as persuasive media, okay, as many scholars have. So communication technologies, broadly understood as encompassing speech, books, images, and mechanical and digital technologies have all long been implemented in service of persuasion. Some of these efforts have proved successful, others have not. Often it's maybe very difficult to disentangle one single media artifact's role in a large social shift and determine the precise ways in which it may have helped or hurt a particular cause. Some of the most persuasive media artifacts that have successfully instigated or cemented social change are understood as propaganda, right? So illustrative example of that would be something like Leni Riefenstahl's 1935 Nazi propaganda film, Triumph of the Will. So watching this film alone will not convince you to become a Nazi. But if you already are a Nazi, it will help to cement and celebrate those beliefs and attitudes. Watching it while steeped in a culture and mediascape that spans that whole cycle of socialization, that also celebrates and normalizes the values of National Socialism might indeed convince you to join the cause, particularly if other nodes in that cycle of socialization, such as friends and family members, have already bought into the ideology. We should talk a little about how media are received and interpreted too. So how media are received and interpreted by viewers has been the subject of study of many fields for more than a century, from psychology to communications and cultural studies. Of particular importance are Stuart Hall's theories on reception, because they recognize the creative agency of the viewer in the interpretive act. And while Hall's focus was mostly on television, his perspective remains relevant for understanding media reception today. Now, at the core of his reception theory, there's a description of a range of possibilities for the viewer as part of what Hall terms the encoding decoding process of communications. So while media creators seek to encode messages in their artifacts, viewers engage then in a decoding process to interpret these artifacts. And Hall describes 3 broad types of decoding that viewers may participate in, even shifting between modes at times. So these reception modes are dominant or hegemonic, in which the viewer pretty much accepts the canonical or intended meaning encoded in the artifact by the creator. Negotiated reception, in which the viewer accepts some parts of the canonical message but takes issue with other aspects. And oppositional reception, in which the viewer disagrees with the canonical message and may creatively appropriate and reinterpret intended meanings to shift them to fit their own value system. Influenced by Stuart Hall's important work on television, media studies scholars have built on that work to tease out the ways in which media interactors today experience interactive, immersive artifacts in a variety of ways. Scholar Jay Bolter has identified 2 main modes of interaction for contemporary media, catharsis and flow. Bolter discusses the aims of more traditional media, such as the novel and Hollywood cinema, as evoking catharsis or an emotional release in the viewer. Interactive media, on the other hand, he argues, work to perpetuate a state of flow in the interactor. Flow is a concept described by psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi and describes an individual state that differs quite a bit from catharsis. Bolter describes that disjunction as follows. He says, catharsis aims at the achievement of a desired emotional state, whereas the state of flow wants to continue forever with minor variations in the intensity of involvement. Flow is the negation of desire, because it does not move towards its own repletion. Bolter also identifies a 3rd mode of reception as reflexivity, citing the modernist avant-garde strategy of disrupting the aesthetics of immersion and flow. with the aim of shifting the viewer into a position of critical distance from the work in which reflection may be possible. This tripartite taxonomy of media aesthetics and reception, catharsis, flow, and reflexivity, is very useful for mapping the majority of media experiences available today. Most do indeed fit within this scope, and many do make use of all three aesthetics to lesser or greater degrees. Interestingly, these three modes of reception are largely characterized as individual, not only by Bolter, but also by other theorists, as well as Csikszentmihalyi, Raymond Williams, Stuart Hall, and others. This individualist focus is useful and necessary for understanding how a single interactor may experience a work, but I think it might be less useful for examining how a work may function in terms of reception if the work aims to instigate social change. Because social change, after all, must happen in the realm of the social. In other words, with other actual humans, as opposed to mediated representations of others. So acknowledging this co-constitutive nature of the social, it's necessary to push past the individualist focus of these concepts of catharsis, flow, and even reflexivity to discuss an aesthetic and reception mode that centers the relationships and communication between multiple humans. And I suggest here that dialogue is a good possibility for this and may provide a way forward as an interaction mode that has potential to foster conditions necessary to enact social change. Dialogue, as described by physicist David Bohm, functions in many ways that are opposite from persuasive media. As a communication practice that is distinct from discussion or debate, dialogue is different, and it prioritizes active listening, attention to process, and questioning for understanding. While a dialogue is often established within a framework of co-design guidelines, those guidelines are not rules, and they may be changed as participants' needs shift and emerge. So unlike a game, a dialogue has no winners or losers, which Bohm describes as follows. He says, in a dialogue, everybody wins if anybody wins. There's a different sort of spirit to it. In a dialogue, there's no attempt to gain points or to make your particular point of view prevail. Rather, whenever any mistake is discovered on the part of anybody, everybody gains. In my own collaborative research with Amy Coron, we have already seen positive results in the application of a critical feminist pedagogy based in dialogue in the transformation of a game design curriculum. Considering the aesthetics of dialogue and the modes of reception and interaction in dialogic communication processes and practices may be a promising way for augmented reality and virtual reality designers to begin to rethink approaches to creating immersive interactive media intended to support social change. So what I'm calling for in this research is an end to the practice of instrumentalizing empathy. What do I mean by the instrumentalization of empathy? Well, that's the taking on of the empathy concept as a means to an end. Instrumentalization here refers to the characterizing of something as a tool or an instrument, mistakenly viewed as neutral and unproblematically not entangled in culture and politics in a kind of fantasy of separation. A shift away from the instrumentalization of empathy in interactive immersive media design won't be easy though. The empathy-centric approach has been strongly entrenched for at least the past 20 years and has had far-reaching consequences. To examine these consequences, it's helpful to return to Lisa Nakamura's research and understand her explanation of how instrumentalized uses of empathy often cross over into a kind of violence, which she describes as toxic empathy. She further identifies the cathartic experience of empathy, often accompanied by tears from a privileged viewer, as actually serving as a kind of alibi for that viewer by supplying a surfeit of feeling as a way to overwhelm the senses and then avoid the labor of taking constructive action. Disturbingly, empathy has also been explicitly instrumentalized as a design tool. And this has been done to make the design process more efficient and easier for the designer by providing the designer with a more seamless way to access the other who is being designed for as opposed to with. The commercial design firm IDEO's published a set of cards intended to assist designers by sharing approaches and methods. And one such card is the Empathy Tools card, which describes the shallow appropriative methods used by the designers to claim access to the subjectivities of potential users of their products who are disabled. The card describes the method as follows. How? Use tools like clouded glasses and weighted gloves to experience processes as though you yourself have the abilities of different users. Why? This is an easy way to prompt an empathic understanding for users with disabilities or special conditions. IDEO designers wore gloves to help them evaluate the suitability of cords and buttons for a home health monitor.
Okay, it seems we have a small problem here. Let's see if she comes back.
We lost you for a minute there, Rebecca. And now you're muted. Classic.
Hello?
Okay, you're back.
Are you all seeing the slides in the right way or not?
We were, but then we lost you for a second. So if you could just share your screen again, we can all see.
Okay, sorry about that.
No problem. Welcome back.
Thanks. Does that look right to folks?
Perfect.
So it's just providing a critique of empathy design tools here. I'm not exactly sure where I got out, but hopefully that's an okay place to jump back in. Okay, thanks, Sarah. So, I think this instrumentalization of empathy as a design tool suggests that the designer can access the experience of disability in a meaningful way by putting on a pair of gloves or glasses. This reduction of disability to a single mechanic, like the reduction of blackness to skin color, or the refugee experience to virtual presence in a particular location, I think all rest on twisted notions of empathy, technology, and social change that have little basis in scholarly research or reality, and they utterly fail to take into account the designer's own positionality. So more recent work from the fields of co-design, participatory design, socially engaged art provide a lot of helpful contributions for moving away from that approach of designing for others and shifting toward designing with and in communities. And there's just a few citations, but I'm sure this community is aware of many more of this research. So stepping back to focus again on the category of works such as VR experiences like De La Pina's Hunger in LA and Out of Exile, Daniel's story. These types of projects have so many layers to unpack. Revealing these works actually function to reinscribe the oppression they claim or hope to push back against. Beyond the aesthetics and ontology of the particular technology and the underlying assumptions regarding the empathic mode of reception, there's also the ethically fraught issue of telling someone else's story, no matter what medium you're using. And in the realm of nonfiction, as these examples all are, this issue is particularly charged. So these examples are rife with serious missteps, such as the taking of voice as opposed to giving it, cultural appropriation, and colonizing moves to extract things of value from the oppressed. These problems are particularly highlighted in the case of stories about other people's pain, oppression, and violence when the designer and the interactor are not part of the communities experiencing these horrors. This extraction and remediation as safe simulation can provide viewers with a perverse sense of pleasure in the suffering of others, even if that pleasure is construed as morally good in the name of providing information for the aim of prejudice reduction. So where does the landscape of instrumentalized empathy leave immersive technologies like AR and VR in the quest for social change and social justice? Well, first, designers must we gotta find our own place in the conversation and then consider technology. This means designers must first work to cultivate critical self-awareness and understanding of their own positionality as always already culturally and politically entangled. The neutral designer is a myth. And this self-knowledge is necessary as a foundation to be able to critically assess how one's own creations participate in the cycles of socialization or liberation. In addition, in the journey to develop self-awareness, it's necessary to maintain some humility to know and hopefully enjoy the fact that we never stop learning. And this journey is never going to be complete, right? So never-ending learning means continually finding out that previously held ideas are wrong. And that's, a fact of life. It's the only alternative to that is willful ignorance. With all that in mind, I suggest a set of dichotomous qualities that are intended to help designers think towards an anti-instrumentalist design approach. This approach is centered on dialogue, as opposed to any particular media technology, and would prioritize human-to-human interaction as opposed to simulation. The qualities associated with human dialogue are counterintuitive for many design processes. So the process of dialogue is not quick. Its outcomes are not disposable. Its work is never finished, and it's not productive in a capitalist sense or very easy to monetize. This approach can be, however, transformative as opposed to informative. While a dichotomy is certainly reductive, the value is in the structure it can provide as a frame for supporting inquiry. And there's an interesting middle space, a third possibility between human dialogue and media simulation that's inhabited by mixed reality. So that blended space of people and technologies may provide the most fertile ground for experimentation in the work of socially engaged immersive design moving forward. In practice, the type of process suggested by these dialogic qualities would take place over multiple years. This would push back against the language of speed, so common in industrial design terms, such as the design sprint. A design process centered in dialogue could be described as a slow approach to design, or design in real time, as opposed to machine time. If the ultimate goal is to develop an AR or VR project that will be truly transformative, the first step is for the designer or the designers to engage in learning about and examining their own social identities and practice being in dialogue with others who have different social identities than their own. I mean, that step might take a few months or a year or more. It certainly can't be accomplished in a 5-day design sprint. There are many resources for this first step of self-examination and dialogue with others available. Following that first step, a second step would be for the designer to spend time in their own community, considering who, including the designer themselves, needs to learn what. And that step might also take a year or so. And resources needed would depend on the particular qualities of the community in which the designer finds themselves and how they're positioned within that community. This second step should also include developing genuine relationships in the community that are naturally pertinent to the design aim. So for example, if the aim is to design for middle school children, consider becoming a volunteer homework tutor at the local middle school or public library. If the aim is to design applications for cultural heritage, visit local museums and heritage sites, get to know the curators and the patrons there. Following those first two steps, designers will be armed with invaluable resources of knowledge and connections that elude many designers who skip ahead. In the third step, the designer should work with their now developed network of contacts to create a series of community roundtables that give a place for everybody at the table, with participatory design workshops to begin to explore the design space of their own community with fellow community members. These events should be designed to facilitate knowledge sharing between the designer, their network, and others. So the designer might find themselves in the position of educating others, perhaps like on the how-tos of AR technology, for example, while the designer might be learning from others about the spaces and history they care most about in the community. And this third step would take at least several months. Finally, a fourth step would involve gathering a more formalized design team and working toward a functional prototype that could be shared with the community in a participatory fashion at iterative stages, leading to a finished project. Many designers begin at the fourth step, and it's easy to see why projects that result are often informational only and not transformational. So this is the crux, to bring us back to Buckminster Fuller's geodesic dome. and utopian vision. If social transformation, if a better future really is the goal, then designers must seek methods that truly transform themselves and participants through co-constituted, consensual, collaborative means that result in transformational knowledge production and meaningful experience. Continuing to corset designers and interactors in simulation can only result in the perpetuation of systems of oppression. So I'll conclude there, and thank you for your attention and bearing with me through the technical difficulties. And share the research that I've shared here will be published this July in a book edited by Joshua Fisher titled Augmented and Mixed Reality for Communities. Thanks very much.